At 38, Michael Turner began noticing something he could not easily explain. Nothing in his life had collapsed. His job was stable. His bills were paid. His days followed a predictable rhythm. And yet somewhere inside that routine, his life had started to feel strangely empty. Not painful, just hollow in a way he could not quite describe. The realization arrived on a quiet Wednesday evening. Michael was sitting at the small kitchen table in his apartment. A half-eaten dinner sat in front of him. The television murmured softly in the background, though he wasn't really watching. He stared at the screen for a moment. Then he muted it. The silence that followed felt heavier than expected. Michael leaned back in his chair and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Nothing had gone wrong that day, but something about the quiet made him feel like he was drifting through his own life rather than actually living it. And that feeling lingered longer than it should have. The next morning looked exactly like most of his mornings. Michael woke up at 6:30. He brewed coffee, showered, drove to the same office building he had been working in for nearly 9 years. He worked as an operations manager for a regional logistics company. The job required organization, patience, and consistency. Michael was good at it. He managed schedules, reviewed reports, and solved small operational problems before they became bigger ones. His coworkers respected him. His boss trusted him. From the outside, his life appeared stable. But lately, stability had begun to feel less like success and more like something quietly holding him in place. The comparison happened during lunch one afternoon. Michael sat at a table in the office break room scrolling through his phone while eating a sandwich. A notification popped up. An old college friend had posted a photo online. The image showed a smiling family standing in front of a new house. 2 children, a dog, a large moving truck parked in the driveway. The caption read, "Finally made the move to Colorado. New chapter." Michael studied the picture longer than he intended. He remembered sitting beside that same friend in a college lecture hall years earlier. Back then, their futures had seemed equally open. Now, watching the photo on his phone, Michael felt something unfamiliar. It wasn't jealousy. It was something quieter. A subtle awareness that everyone's life had moved somewhere, except his. That evening, Michael went for a walk. It was something he had started doing recently when his apartment felt too quiet. The neighborhood streets were calm. Streetlights cast soft yellow pools of light across the sidewalk. Michael walked slowly, hands in his jacket pockets. His mind wandered through the last 15 years of his life. College graduation, his first real job, promotions, the brief marriage that had ended 4 years earlier, the routine that followed afterward. He realized something uncomfortable. For most of his adult life, he had been focused on doing what seemed responsible. Work hard, stay steady, avoid mistakes. But somewhere along the way, he had stopped asking what any of it was actually for. The thought stayed with him for days. Michael began noticing small moments that previously felt invisible. The quiet drive to work, the repetitive meetings, the evenings spent alone in a tidy apartment. None of it was bad, but none of it felt meaningful either. And that realization carried a subtle fear. If life already felt empty at 38, what would it feel like at 50? The question lingered quietly in the back of his mind, and Michael wasn't sure he wanted the answer. Over the following months, the feeling grew harder to ignore. Michael began noticing how often his life revolved around routine rather than intention. Every weekday followed the same rhythm: work, commute, dinner, television, sleep. At the office, younger employees had started joining the company. Some of them spoke with a kind of confidence that Michael remembered having when he was their age. They talked about building careers, launching projects, moving cities. Michael listened politely during meetings, but sometimes he felt a strange pressure in his chest. Not because they were doing something wrong, but because their energy reminded him of a version of himself that seemed far away. One afternoon during a strategy meeting, a junior manager presented a proposal to restructure part of the department. The idea was sharp and ambitious. Michael noticed something unexpected. For a moment, he felt tired. Not physically tired. Something deeper. As if part of him had quietly stepped away from the race without fully realizing it. Later that evening, he sat alone in his apartment again. The silence returned, and with it a realization that felt difficult to name. Michael had spent years focusing on stability, but stability alone did not seem to create meaning. It simply created time, and time, when left unexamined, had a strange habit of passing unnoticed. One night Michael found himself thinking about something his father used to say. When Michael was younger, his father had worked long hours running a small construction business. He rarely talked about emotions or personal struggles. But sometimes late in the evening, he would say something simple. Being a man means carrying responsibility whether you feel like it or not. Michael had always interpreted that idea in a very practical way. Work hard, provide, avoid failure. But sitting in his quiet apartment at 38, he began wondering if responsibility meant something deeper. Maybe responsibility was not only about paying bills or maintaining stability. Maybe it also involved paying attention to the direction of one's life. Michael realized that for years, he had allowed momentum to make decisions for him. He stayed in the same city because moving felt inconvenient. He stayed in the same routines because they were familiar. He stayed emotionally quiet because it felt easier than explaining uncertainty. None of those choices were dramatic, but together they had created a life that felt strangely passive. And Michael began to understand something uncomfortable. Emptiness did not always come from failure. Sometimes it came from living too carefully for too long. Most men assume emptiness appears after losing everything. But sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes the feeling arrives when nothing is technically wrong. When life becomes stable, predictable, comfortable, and quietly disconnected from purpose. The shift did not arrive as a dramatic breakthrough. It began with a small moment. One Saturday morning, Michael woke up earlier than usual. Sunlight filtered through the blinds. Instead of reaching for his phone, he sat quietly on the edge of his bed. He thought about the years ahead, not in a dramatic way, just realistically. Another 10 years could easily pass in the same routine. Work, evenings alone, occasional social events. Time moving forward without much intention behind it. The thought unsettled him, but instead of pushing the feeling away, Michael allowed himself to sit with it. For the first time in years, he asked a simple question. If life already felt empty, what small changes would make it feel less so? The answer did not arrive immediately, but the question itself felt important. Over the following weeks, Michael began making small adjustments to his routine. Nothing dramatic. He started waking up 30 minutes earlier. Instead of scrolling through his phone, he spent that time sitting quietly with a notebook. At first, he wrote simple observations about his days. Gradually, those notes turned into something else. Questions about work, thoughts about what kind of man he wanted to become over the next decade. He also returned to something he had abandoned years earlier: running. 3 evenings a week, Michael jogged slowly through the same neighborhood streets he used to walk. The runs were not impressive, but they gave his days a different rhythm. Physical movement had a way of clearing mental noise. At work, he began volunteering for projects he previously avoided, not because they guaranteed promotion, but because they required engagement. And something interesting began happening. The emptiness did not disappear overnight, but it started losing its grip. Michael realized that meaning rarely arrived as a sudden discovery. It was usually built through responsibility, attention, and small, deliberate effort. By the time Michael turned 39, his life did not look dramatically different from the outside. He still worked in the same office. He still lived in the same apartment. His daily routine remained relatively simple, but internally, something had shifted. He understood 3 things more clearly than before. First, time moves quietly, and when a man stops paying attention, entire years can pass without intention. Second, stability is not the same as meaning. It provides the foundation for life, but it cannot replace direction. And third, self-respect is built through small, consistent decisions, not dramatic reinventions, just daily evidence that a man is still participating in his own life. If you have ever experienced a quiet moment where your life suddenly feels strangely empty, it may not be a crisis. It may simply be a signal, a reminder to pause, to look honestly at the direction of your days, and to decide quietly and deliberately what kind of life you want the next decade to become.